everyone, it's Justine. It's been a while since I've done just a single card tutorial, and I really thought I would show this card off that I made recently. I'm going to be using the stencil from GKD Designs called Foliage. This is a really pretty stencil, and I love all the detail on it. So what I did was I attached my cardstock to the back of the stencil, and then I attached the stencil to my craft mat so that it stays in place. I'm going to be using Distress Oxide inks to go over the stencil. Now, because these are oxide, they are a mixture of pigment as well as dye ink, which means that they will show up on a dark cardstock. So I'm using a very dark gray cardstock that I had in my stash. I want to say it's from My Favorite Things, but I'm not too sure. And I am smooshing it down here onto my cardstock, and I'm ink blending carefully, and I'm going back and forth between the colors. So I started with Wilted Violet, continued with Abandoned Coral, and you can see I went back to Wilted Violet in order to blend. Then I'm going to go in with some picked raspberry towards the top, and I'm going to continue on. I always like to keep out two brushes or two handles, one with the previous color so I can go back and just reinforce that blend. The last color I'm going to be using is Spiced Marmalade, and I'm just going to use that at the top of the foliage. So once I was finished with that, I then realized that my cardstock wasn't exactly centered with the stencil. Now there's an easy trick and an easy fix for this. So once I realized that, I was able to just cut it down in order for it to be centered. So I removed my stencil, and you'll see how pretty it looks on the back of the cardstock. Also, if you spritz a little bit with water, the oxide inks will come even more vibrant, but I wanted to keep them subtle here. So in order to center it, I took a stitched die that I had in my stash, and I centered those two little flourishes in the middle so that it looked like it was centered, and I was able to fix my little mistake there. So I cut that using my Big Shot off screen, and then I came back with this really stitched pretty background here that is nice and centered. So once that was finished, I grabbed a piece of cardstock that was 11 by 4 1/4, and I scored it in half at 5.5 inches to attach my little panel here in a top folding card. And then I went ahead and I stamped all the sentiments. So I believe that So Susie Stamps has some of the most beautiful sympathy sentiments. Now, sympathy cards, I like to put something else other than Deepest Sympathy or With Sympathy or something like that. I think this is an occasion that calls for a little bit more of a personal touch, so I do enjoy the stamps quite a bit. So on a scrap piece of paper, I stamped the Strength for Today stamp from So Susie Stamps, and then I stamped the Walk Beside Us on the inside of the card. Now, the stamp you can see is a little bit too big for my block, and what happens when you do that is that the stamps end up a little bit lopsided on the ends, but that doesn't really matter to me. That's called a personal card, and that's why it's handmade, because it has these little flaws. But if you put it onto a MISTI, it would have had no problem. I was just being really lazy, and that teaches me to not be lazy and use my MISTI stamping tool. So such pretty sentiments, really personal for a sympathy card. So I cut down that Strength for Today stamp, attached some 3D foam tape on the back, and then just added that to my card in white. I think it really stands out against the colorful background, and I think that the colors are very subtle and really good for a sympathy card. Then I went in with some transparent Nuvo drops. These are the jewel drops, and this is the gray color. And what I did was I just went along the flourishes here to add a little bit of an extra embellishment. And actually, the way it dried is super cool because it went clear, and I think it looks really pretty. So there's a final look at the card. If you enjoyed this card tutorial today and are interested in any of the supplies used, please feel free to head to my blog or the video description below. I have supply lists and everything you need to know about this card. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and have a great week.